Welcome everybody that's listening around the world right now. Our webinar is going to be the topic of staying competitive while having ethical standards at the core. We've got a fantastic lineup today of world leaders around the world again. First of all, we've got Professor Fraser Sampson, who is the Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometric Material and Surveillance Camera Commissioner for the UK Home Office. We have Ashley Moore, who has a wealth of experience in AI strategy, AI policy, and AI procedure, and also developing those standardizations. And finally, we have IREX CEO Calvin Yadav, who has a wealth of experience in engineering and electronic warfare. So to open up this webinar, we've asked all our panelists to do an opening statement on how companies and how companies can stay competitive while having ethical standards at the core. So first up, we've got Professor Fraser Sampson, who's going to give us a quick 2-minute intro on how to do that. So Fraser, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Daniel, thank you very much. Is that coming through now?
Perfect.
Thank you, and thank you very much to IREX for inviting me for this discussion on what is really topical and important issue. Forgive me in advance, Daniel, if I go slightly over your 2 minutes, but I think it occurs to me that the interface between ethics and competition isn't new, and it certainly isn't peculiar to AI. You just need to look around, and anywhere where there's a market, there is this inherent tension, whether it's vehicle manufacturers falsifying carbon emission data, accountancy firms burying bad numbers, or elite athletes evading doping tests, all in the name of winning, or at least not losing. In my area, which is surveillance technology, I think that ethically competitive democracies will come from triangulation, from balancing what is technically possible with what's legally permissible and what is societally acceptable. Or in short, the challenge is to find the sweet spot between what can be done, what must or mustn't be done, and what different communities will tolerate being done. And even in mature democracies, that will vary considerably. And I emphasize democracies here because I recognize that not all international competitors subscribe to the same ethical values. Whether that will come to be seen as a constraint or an advantage in the long run, only time will tell. But I think for me, ethical competitiveness will certainly involve purpose, principles, and proportionality. We know how humanitarian uses of biometric surveillance can literally save lives, channel funds, and provide refuge to some of the world's most vulnerable people. But in the field of surveillance, one person's protection is another person's oppression. And once built, the same systems can be used for domination and exploitation. They can be used to marginalize, persecute, and prosecute. Which brings us back to the triangulation. And a key question in my area is, how do we know that our systems, i.e. what's possible, are only being used for legitimate authorized purposes, i.e. what's permissible, and in a way that the affected community is prepared to support what is acceptable. So acceptability to the tribe is what I would call ethics here. And ethical practice is probably a differentiator at the moment, I realize, but I sincerely hope it doesn't remain that way. I think in a mature market, surely it should become a legitimate expectation, an irreducible minimum like safety. I think ethics should be a standard that comes as standard. If you're not offering it, you can't compete. I think in the setting of AI, maybe ethics should be seen like the number 0, the very thing that allows us to count and code, or as described by mathematician Robert Kaplan, the smallest of pivots on which swing all of the parts. What are the hallmarks of ethical competition? I'm not quite sure, but you'll know unethical competition when you see it. So I'll finish on a personal note. I'm a keen runner, if not a competitive one, and a devout user of the Nike Run Club app. And on my run today, they used a quote from Jeff Johnson, Nike's very first employee. That quote was, "Compete with others, not against others." And I think there's something there for staying competitive within ethical boundaries. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you for that, Fraser. That was fantastic. And before we move on to Ashley, I just want to point out that Ashley has created a fact sheet surrounding staying competitive while having ethical standards at the core, and that will be distributed out to all attendees and anybody who wants a copy of it. You'll also be able to find a copy of it on our website, and I'll give you the information later. So Ashley, great to have you here today. And what does staying competitive while having ethical standards at the core mean to you?
Well, hi, everyone. I'm glad for being invited to do this with you. And the previous speaker, he's covered a lot of the same things that I was going to cover. It's just a caveat to what he has said. I look at this, I work AI governance and compliance and standards at a national level as well as the federal agency level. So I can give you those views and those perspectives. I look at AI ethics pretty much as you see Alan Turing Institute approaches to AI ethics, that an ethical human-centric AI must be designed and developed in a manner that is aligned with the values and ethical principles of society and the community it affects. Ethics is based on a well-founded standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society, fairness, and specific values. Something that the previous speaker brought up, I look at this and protecting the nation and its compliance requirements and standards development, as well as the organization. You have two aspects of this: the organization that is internally developing AI to meet strategic goals and objectives, and then you have the vendors, the issue of making a quick dollar or becoming the gold standard in the marketplace. I lean more towards the gold standard in turning AI trustworthiness as a competitive differentiator in the global marketplace, building ethics into the system and having the documentation ready available during contract negotiations is the number one priority. When marketing your AI products or service, you have to consider national rules to ensure that AI is safe, developed, used in compliance with fundamental rights and obligations. If you look out now on the horizon, the things that happen with the world market, with the World Economic Forum and the EU Commission with GDPR, they have taken on AI and they've written the first foundational regulations and headed and pushed towards the development of standards and compliance programs. So when you have this body involved in this process and in the marketplace, you're going to see compliance be put forth to you. What I see coming and happening in some of the large companies is they're pushing the vendors to have self-declaration of compliance, and as well as organizations internally, that you have to have that documentation and self-declaration that you've applied your principles, you've applied the standards, you have a means in which to show that we can trust the product, and then it's worth the value of buying that product or service or using that product or service inside the organization. That's it.
Thank you, Ashley. And now just moving on to our third opening statement from Calvin. Calvin, what does staying competitive while having ethical standards at the core mean to you?
Well, in the world of AI, ethics is the bridge between revenue and innovation. So first of all, thank you for setting this up, Daniel. And as we're discussing ethical AI, in my experience running an AI company, during the time when social pressure is constantly growing on the ethical use of the tech, it's not just about the scalability of the technology, but the actual impact it brings on our lives. I've spoken to actually a ton of leaders who are running AI companies, who are part of or trying to push this ethical agenda. And in order to innovate, or I should say the speed with which we want to innovate is much more important than the responsibility of ethical usage of their tech. And for the companies that have good to great tech, needs to lean into this part of the responsibilities. We can't just say that we have no responsibility of like how our end user uses our platform under the umbrella of licensing contracts or free speech. And one of the first things I made a priority as running an AI company is to grab this lightning rod of responsibility and lean into the social impact that my company brings on. I made a point that I do not want to hide behind technicalities, that we are a tech company and nothing to do with the social issues that surrounds basically my entire everyday life. And right now, as we're discussing this, the pace with which AI is developing is extremely rapid. And the use cases where our society can use good tech is growing by the minutes. And creating, we're discussing this, creating a competitive advantage with ethical AI, while ethical AI is transforming every segment of our lives. Like we discussed last week, the stadium securities, medical field, agriculture, autonomous car, and as Ashley and Fraser point out, even national security strategies. So we can't just ignore all this. And finally, I personally think in the SaaS world or in the security business world, we must understand the data and how this data affects the society. From there, as leaders, we can design our business development strategy. And by understanding the social impact on our society, with mixing it with a great AI-powered platform, for me, that is a creation of a revenue generating strategy. And I'm looking forward to discussing this in much more details. Thank you. Back to you.
Great, Calvin. So we're just going into the part of the webinar now, where it's going to be a Q&A section from the audience and already predetermined questions from emails from people that couldn't make today. So we'll go into a Q&A section, and then I just want a little bit of back and forth between Fraser, Calvin, and Ashley. So the first question that came in earlier was from Trevor Collins, Public Safety Director in the United States. His question is really going for the juggernaut straight away. Is facial recognition a matter of time? I'm going to let Fraser take that one. So it is facial recognition just a matter of time?
Yes, it's a matter of time. It's a matter of our time. It's being used in areas in the UK already. It's being used in a way that is accountable. It's in a way that is answerable, that is transparent, that is auditable and verifiable. It's another manifestation of technical capability that can be used or misused in the same way as any other. There was a US professor who once said that every new technology simultaneously brings the possibility of emancipation and oppression at the same time. And it's the way in which we use it that is the important thing for me. And some of the discussions that I've had around constraining the use of facial recognition, I've not quite understood, partly because citizens need to have faith and trust in the whole ecosystem of surveillance and biometrics in my world. So it's unhelpful to single out one technological application over any others. And it's irrational to demonize it. But it's certainly caught the attention of certainly the sort of lay sector, if you like, the people who are forming opinions about this, who don't necessarily have the same expertise and background and interests as the audience and speakers here. But my early position on the use of facial recognition technology by the police in England and Wales was not only ought they be able to use it, they've got a legal and moral obligation in some settings to use it, and any other reliable technological application that is within their reasonable means.
Absolutely, it's a great comment saying that the police forces have a moral obligation to use this type of technology. That's interesting because that's not quite what you see in the United States, is it, Ashley? What's your comment on that?
Well, I can tell you, like a lot of the members of the EU and as well as some states in the United States have piggybacked on a very specific element in the GDPR, and that's the right to be forgotten. So whether it's the use of the Internet of Things, biometrics, it really doesn't matter. They have taken on this and issued out statutes and laws in order to keep this from happening. But that aside, 50 states and territories, there's a lot of states that are kind of free range and a little bit of the Wild West with using biometrics. So you see on the legislative side, this starting to spin up in this administration with proposed bills in order to contain the use of biometrics within the states or within the country. States are sovereign, so states get to create their own laws and regulations. So, but you'll see this as a trend.
It's interesting the broad term, the right to be forgotten, because what does that quite mean? And when you're touching on that, you've got abilities to maybe find missing people by going back in time and providing search surveillance. How do you see, what's your stand on that, Calvin?
Yeah, so see, my view on that is probably a little controversial, because something I live and breathe. One of the first thing I did was I decided to propose that we're gonna work absolutely free with no cost charging to the end user when it comes to human trafficking, fight against human trafficking, and a fight against child trafficking. And we decided, as being a father myself, we decided that we want to help DHS and all these other agencies to locate these missing children and missing women, because it's something sort of taking from what Fraser said, and I was making my notes when Fraser was speaking, that it's a moral responsibility for someone like me to use this tech for good. However, I also think certain applications should decide the innovation, meaning that in an application of human trafficking or missing children, we have to keep the data in real time, because I'm not going to give in details here, like something that we're doing where with the DHS, that they have to see in real time that, hey, this child has been missing for X amount of months and all that. And if I don't even want to distract the conversation from this webinar, that how intensive human hard work it requires to locate a person on the internet today. It's all done by manually. There is no actual tech that automates that. So if I have a good tech, as they say, the great tech comes with great responsibilities, I want to use that. But for that, I need to keep the data, and I can't just delete the data of these missing women and missing children. And I think it's my moral responsibility to push innovation on that.
It's interesting that, because the right to be forgotten is a broad term and there's no standardizations around it. I do know, Fraser, you've been working on such kind of standardizations regarding that, and I know that you've got a few ideas, and you are pushing a few of the best practices right now across the UK. Is that correct?
I think there's little quarrel with the right to be forgotten. It was relatively new in Europe, and it made its way in, as Ashley said, in the form of the GDPR and subsequent legislation, because it hadn't previously existed. And of course, yes, people are entitled to say, why are you keeping my image? Why are you keeping my biometric data? Under what power? For what purpose? Who are you going to share it with? And if you can't answer those questions, then delete it. And you should be able to answer those questions, principally because you should have asked yourself them before you captured the data in the first place. And you should have very clear policies that are promulgated that I can go to and read in advance and see what your rules are. And some of those rules will be in relation to practicality, and some will be in relation to ethical and wider principles. Interestingly for me, retention, which is what we're talking about, is an area that's quite often overlooked. If you look at some of the live facial recognition technology that's been used and in some areas condemned for the way in which it's used around the world, the retention of the images of people who are being screened, the many to one, is almost instantaneous deletion, in which case it's far less intrusive, arguably, than taking someone's photograph when they're arrested and brought into custody and hanging onto it for a month or a year or forever. So I think it's understanding where some of those principles apply and then looking at them across the board. And I think also, as Calvin said, that there are some types of criminal offending, and we can expect there to be more of them, where your only hope, really, of detecting them and preventing them in the future is by using some form of AI and some technical response. You're not going to deal with these type of offenders by knocking on doors and walking up the garden path with a clipboard. And as I said earlier, in terms of ethics, yes, surveillance systems and capabilities can be used for marginalizing and prosecuting individuals. Some groups may need to be marginalized and prosecuted. Active terrorists, people who trade in human beings, people who run pay-per-view child rape websites. I've yet to hear a compelling argument why they ought not to be the subject of all reasonable means available to policing and law enforcement. But it goes back to, Daniel, one of the points I made about purpose, principles, and proportionality. It plainly isn't proportionate to deploy the same technology in dealing with threats to national security as it would be someone breaking the lockdown conditions in their local supermarket or bar, for example. And that's what accountable governance looks like. It comes back to proportionality of use, and the people who should demonstrate that, I believe, are the people who are using it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of bring that up, that I also think that this one thing that we had to sort of, in my opening statement, I mentioned that we had to take this lightning rod and lean into these responsibilities. So when we are developing our code and when we are developing our architect, something I had to emphasize to the engineers and everybody, that we have to emphasize on making this trustworthy and making this framework of transparency, that how does your code actually comes up with this type of outcome, right? And I think that's what you're trying to say, Fraser, that it's not about the retention of the data, it's about the explanation and the responsibility of the data, that, hey, what sort of your architect came up with the conclusion that how did it come up with these results, and this transparency factor built into like a platform and demonstrating that how the code is written and how it logs the user and the way no one can get away with this type of misuse of the platform. And I think we have, as a tech companies, we have to emphasize this trustworthy and this transparency by design type of coding a lot more, and should be speaking about this a lot further and louder. I wanted to ask a little bit a question to both of you, Fraser and Ashley, that how do you think UK and Europe and America are differentiating in these markets, like of AI, facial recognition, vehicle identification, mass shooters? How do you think acceptance of AI is differentiating into these two regions, North America versus UK and Europe?
Ashley, if you want to just take that first, and then we'll go on to Fraser a second.
I think that's a fair question. What has happened rapidly, and we'll step back to say 3-4 years ago. China produced its strategy for AI, a very robust, aggressive strategy, and for the development and use, deployment of AI across the broad domain of things that they have in their basket. Behind that, the EU and its members spin up strategies, policies, procedures, the legal mechanisms behind that. And now, here within the last few years, there's 53 nations that have established AI strategies with a complement of legal frameworks, laying down harmonizing rules for AI development, procurement, and quality management. Key emphasis on quality management, which is something that Fraser had brought up what he said previously. So what comes out of that is the audit piece of this. Whether you're going to audit internally, the methodologies for auditing AI internally, or in big corporations, they have an already established audit mechanism for the supply chain. And then within the federal government, we have the Office of Inspector General. So the methodologies for auditing AI in all funnel aspects of development, procurement, deployment, the data, the user, the output, the documentation, all that due diligence is going to come to bear in the next couple of years once these methodologies for auditing, whether it's in the public sector or private sector, have been harmonized and start to get used. So, you can see this evolving already.
It's a fantastic point what you said with transparency. I'm going to put a pin in that. I'm just going to go over to you, Fraser, just to see what you've been to touch on what Calvin said. The differentiators between the UK and Europe, what you're seeing compared to the United States right now.
Yes, I mean, obviously, it is a very different setting for policing stroke law enforcement in those two areas, even though Europe covers a number of different jurisdictions. From some of the discussions I've had, there is, it sounds more as though it is some of the resistance in the United States is more of an issue of legitimacy about policing generally, and the use of AI or increasing technology becomes, if you like, a manifestation of it, in which the broader discussions around legitimacy and community support can take place. Within the UK and the wider EU, I think the point that Ashley made, actually some of this is that in a Venn diagram, there'll be a very clear overlap between data protection issues and frameworks and other broader public obligations and the use of AI and technology, because there are somewhere that the rules apply equally in that area. If you look in terms of the public sector equality duty, for example, that affects all public services and public service providers in England and Wales, that would incorporate your ability to demonstrate that the AI technology you were deploying in providing public services here did not discriminate inappropriately or unfairly or contained no unacceptable levels of bias. And if you couldn't demonstrate that, then I think you'll be in some difficulty. Therefore, if you're bringing a product to market, which you credibly want to sell to public services here, and it'll be paid for with citizens' precepted monies and deployed in their interests, then you need to have asked yourself these questions in advance too, to say, how do I know? How have I assured myself that this doesn't discriminate unfairly by itself, let alone in the way in which it's used by an agency later? Once you've done that, then it comes back to basic layers of accountability and use of any technology. One of the things that has really interested me since coming into this role in March is when you look at other regulatory frameworks and bodies that exist around what is sort of totemic technological capability. And if you look at human embryology, for example, that raises some of the most elemental ethical questions that we're ever likely to face. And yet, there isn't the same debate happening, so far as I'm aware, about fears of misuse or accountability or answerability or oversight. And there's a report from an institute here that shows that the human embryology regulator is the most trusted in the UK. And one of the things that interests me is, why is that? What is it that we trust so much in that setting that we appear to be less willing to extend here? Or maybe is it simply, again, to go back to your first question, a matter of time and timing, and we're becoming more skeptical, perhaps even more cynical about the potential application of technology at a scalable level. And therefore, there is a greater need for assurance around answerability and auditable accountability. And I'm not quite sure where we are with that yet.
It brings up a great point, and we just got a great comment what came up: trust but verify. So it's okay building the code. It's okay coming from the ethical standards of building the tech. How do you ensure that the client is using it ethically and correctly as well? And how do you trust them, but also verify at the same time? I'm going to go with Calvin for this one.
Yes, so I can speak on my experience and something that we are doing and keeping these values of these transparency by design promise, and building up on that, we have started to develop within our company user management compliance. Basically, it's a standard that it get audited, and we have also put it into our business development strategy about the pricing and all that, where end user given a set of standards, and then the user management annually gets audited that, hey, are they using this ethically or not? But there's a back end of it too, which is that how easy it is to audit it. So something like the AI platform that I built, which is that it has a auditable self-auditation. So you can actually see what Ashley did, what Fraser did, what Daniel did, what Calvin did. It's not like Daniel can overwrite Ashley or something and say, okay, he run a facial recognition or vehicle identification or a weapon detection of this, and he can delete that. That's kind of thing we have taken out. And we are very open about to show that how our AI comes up with the conclusion and how it did it. So just to recap, we created a user management compliance standard that we apply on our end users, and we don't just expect our end users to do that. Second thing is we have annual audits that affects them to give them discounts if they keep following those audits. And the third is that our transparency by design framework, which shows our code and how it comes up with the answers. So that's what I'm doing. I know a lot of companies or a lot of big companies are doing things a little different. I have a question back to you, Daniel and Fraser, and actually to the whole panel, is that if certain type of AIs are very much sensitive to the society, do you think companies should spend enough hours and dollars in the beginning to make sure it's just not an MVP? For example, and this is Daniel brought up facial recognition. A lot of companies that I see are startups and they claim to be facial recognition, but they have a massive false positive. And some of them get deployed into local cities or small towns in UK, Europe, where I've seen these everywhere. And then they give false positive, and that sort of bad image or bad news puts a bad impression on the entire innovation or entire application of facial recognition. So my question back to the panel is that should companies invest for certain type of AI module, invest enough time, hours and money in the beginning, because these type of AI modules have actual direct impact on our society? And that's kind of my question back. And it's an open thought. I was thinking about it because I come across this all the time.
Ashley, do you want to take that from your side, what you're seeing, writing the standardizations, writing the user guides? I can imagine that it's constantly an evolution in that process. So would you like to just take that?
Well, let me use an analogy. And you probably might remember this, when Da Vinci's children, the UAVs first started coming out, they were already in the marketplace and already being used by people. But soon as someone invaded someone's privacy, as soon as they did something attached a gun to it and flew it over somebody's airspace, or they flew it over near the airport, or they flew it over the White House, the legal system comes out. And then the marketplace is in trouble, because now the regulatory framework is going to be put in place. It's going to be put in place very fast. And then you will become compliant, and it goes all the way back to the developer down into the individual who built the software. That's how deep it goes. So the same thing is happening with AI. Once it has broken enough rules and made enough people upset, the international legal system, and I mean the international law system, as well as each country, as well as each state, locality, it starts to spin up. I have an entire folder, at least almost a terabyte worth of legal stuff that I keep capturing and dumping in, and promise myself I will go back and read to see what it is that they're trying to wrestle with. The biggest thing is that the legal side doesn't have enough experts right now for AI, but it will not take them long. All you have to do is type in Google AI and law, and you'll spend the next couple of days reading about all the things that are going wrong and what's going to happen and what they see happening. Legislation on my side is spinning up, and it's spinning up fast in different forms and for different areas of AI.
That's a great point in terms of legality, and it's very fortunate that we've got somebody on our panel that's got a background in such things. So Fraser, from a legal perspective, what's happening?
So I think, we go back, don't we, to the three things that I introduced, which is the technical capability, the legal permissibility, and societal acceptability. We know that they're moving at differential speeds. The tech is moving at redshift speeds away from anything else. And so it should, because that's how we got here, and it's how we'll get where we need to be. The legal issues have sort of dominated for a while because they're the mechanism for imposing some kind of restraint or accountability in a very hard-nosed way. But lawyers anywhere in the world will tell you that litigation focuses on the sifted and agreed facts between the adversaries that we agree on. This is what we're going to go to court about. This is what we'll row on, and this is what we hope to win on. And so you've already sifted out and refined some of the issues that are capable of being resolved in a judgment in any event, even if it doesn't get appealed over the next however many years. But the thing for me that is the most different now from anything I've seen before is that third aspect, which is societal acceptability, where people are saying, I don't care that you can do this. I don't care that you could persuade a judge that it's all right on the facts as you've portrayed them when you've got on your hind legs. I don't want you doing it either to me or in my name. And that's why, picking up again on Ashley's point there, the importance is communicating with people in advance, with communities, and saying, here is what we're proposing to do. Help us in assessing whether it actually achieves what we want it to do. Don't take your most controversial product and make that your starting point. You didn't go out in the street, I don't think, start tasering people to test the voltage to see what people could tolerate before everyone started buying tasers over here. And don't always then give it to the most controversial setting. So let's say there are some things where other blue light providers may be better placed to test things because, let's face it, there is a greater degree of support and a lesser degree of anxiety in its use with certain blue light providers than there might be for policing and law enforcement. Not because the latter are behaving improperly, but because one of their functions is to enforce the law and to catch people who are committing crimes. And I think if you try and get that understanding and also proper, reliable, scientific approach to product development before it comes out on the street, so you can not only answer these questions but invite them. Scientists often show up to things not because they've got all the answers, because they haven't got them. That's why they want to try things. And I think that different approach will be much more likely to succeed. What we don't know yet is how much that has been eroded by not following that more measured process along the way. And the final point I make from a legal perspective is, if your technology is going to be used forensically, i.e. it is going to be used to support or defend a prosecution, then you better be sure that it works, because otherwise someone will quite properly jump up and down all over it, whether that's in a very local criminal prosecution or a matter of sort of terrorism and higher end serious organized criminal activity. But if it's going to be deployed and relied upon in a prosecution, then you really need to have tested it, because the thresholds in most jurisdictions for that are very high, and quite rightly so.
That's a great point, Fraser, and it brings us into the conclusion of today's webinar. And coming from the public and private sector across our three panelists today, what I'd like to have is just a closing statement from each of you in regards to what you envisage over the next 12 to 18 months. It's very open-ended. You're all coming from various different backgrounds, so I think it'll be very interesting for our viewers. So I'd like to just start with Ashley. What do you envisage in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I'll speak on one area that I work in a lot, and that's standards and development and compliance. Daniel's going to hand this out in the document. You really should look at it. When you think about the development of AI standards, whether it's IEEE or ISO, and mostly ISO, is that who are the organizations that are involved in the development of those standards? And where are they in the marketplace? Because they're influencing the marketplace. And the ISO process is you pay to play. It's not free just to go in and pick up a chair and sit in the committee and go about influencing the process of development of a standard. So you need to look at that and ask yourself a question, who are these people at the table, and how do they influence me and influence what I want to do and where I want to be in the marketplace? Because that's evolving, and it's evolving fast. The same thing within the US, we're very open about the standards that are being developed, and you can comment to them publicly because they're always posted by the Standard Development Organization. Whereas these standards that are developed in ISO, they're not posted so that you can make a public comment to them. You've got to be in the room, and you got to be in there to participate. So the other aspect about this is that, this is a very fast growing industry, and last year alone was almost $30 billion made in the area of AI. So by 2026, we're looking at about $300 billion that's going to be made, and that's between 2021 and 2026. So, you need to pay attention to these things, and then behind it is the compliance programs that are going to spin up. So the big push right now is supplier declaration of compliance, because the compliance system in itself has not caught up with the marketplace.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Ashley. And as a reminder, Ashley's fact sheet on ethically designed and aligned AI with ethical standards at the core will be available on our website, and it'll be distributed to all you that have signed up for the webinar. Thank you for that, Ashley. So Calvin, your thoughts on what you envisage for the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I think I'll keep it in from the point of view of business leadership and human-centric tech. And I would like to just say to all the fellow leaders that while we're growing the company and adjusting our strategies, adjust your understanding of the theoretical capabilities and limitations of your AI platform. And I believe like your company and your AI software both needs to be scalable. So look for multi-talent and making sure during the R&D phase that it solves multiple problems. Taking this box basically in your product development roadmap will allow your company to embrace ethical and standards forefront. And in order to win the trust of legislators and standards creators, as Ashley and Fraser are talking about this and nailing this final point one more time, showcase the back end of your algorithm to demo the human aware algorithms will create your differentiator, meaning AI that keeps the humans in mind when making decisions. And for that, we as organizational leaders needs to improve our data sets that we use to code our human aware algorithms. And that will conclude my closing statement.
It's a great point. I think I do envisage the industry really looking now more so towards the back end, because over the last few years, the AI companies have brought out lots of shiny new things, which has got a lot of people's attention. And I think that now over the next 12 to 18 months, people are going to be looking at the back end as well. So great point, Calvin. So finally, I'd just like to turn to Fraser. What are you envisaging in the next 12 to 18 months?
Thank you. I think to bring those, coincidentally, to bring those last 2 points together, I think whereas there is the supplier's declaration of compliance that Ashley spoke of, which I absolutely endorse. I love that concept, and I think that will become essential in most settings. But I think then Calvin's point that he made much earlier in the discussion around the client's, the user's responsibility at both ends. So both to the people supplying users with the technology and the people who are the subjects of it. And I can see that there would be an expansion into the client's declaration of compliance, which then just wouldn't be a standards-based issue. It would become contractual and legal and auditable, and ultimately the reputation of the organization would stand or fall on it. And we've, we're 30 odd years past Michael Porter's value chain now, and we've understood supply chains. I would imagine, and I would hope, that we will get to an ethics chain where it is past the ethical considerations are passed like a baton in a relay race from everyone involved in the production and use and review and monitoring and then learning and feedback to the first person. That's what I would think we should go.
Thank you for that, Fraser. A great way to conclude the webinar. So again, thank you all, Calvin, Fraser and Ashley, for attending today. You'll give the audience and you'll give the viewers your views from different aspects and different angles of the industry. And again, this will be available on the IREX website and on the IREX YouTube channel. So thank you all for attending, and see you next time.